Hi everyone, welcome to week 7, Wittgenstein, Meaning and Forms of Life. This week we finally arrive at the major work which Wittgenstein had been thinking about and producing after he had rejected the Tractatus. This work has been posthumously published as the Philosophical Investigations, but Wittgenstein wasn't necessarily ultimately satisfied with it in his lifetime, and so it was edited after he died and finally published. He says in the introduction that he's not happy with it because, well, he mentions that the book doesn't proceed in the ordinary way that a philosophical book proceeds from, for instance, a starting point where one poses some question that one wants to answer, goes through a series of inquiries and ends up finally at a conclusion, and where there's a kind of natural development from beginning to middle and then end. The Philosophical Investigations doesn't progress in that way. Indeed, the Investigations really is a series of remarks, as Wittgenstein says. And what Wittgenstein does in the book is repeatedly return to the same issues over and over again, tweaking his treatment of them, extending his treatment, finding connections with other issues. Then he'll jump to another topic and he'll eventually come back to the issues that we were looking at earlier, that he was looking at earlier. So it's not a book that you just pick up and read from start to finish and go, well, I found out what Wittgenstein thinks. I think of the book, this is my own sort of way of thinking about it, I think of it as a kind of hurricane that starts out very sort of vague, spins around a variety of issues. As Wittgenstein continues in the book, that hurricane sort of tightens up and he spins around the same issues, but he does so with perhaps greater precision and incorporating some of the results that he's done earlier. But it's a very, very striking and unique philosophical text due to that form, where he's repeatedly approaching the same philosophical problems over and over again. Sometimes he feels satisfied that he's hit those issues well, and sometimes he thinks he's missed them. And we'll see that exact same approach of repeatedly looking at the same issues from perhaps slightly different perspectives. We'll look at that approach again in Wittgenstein's last work, On Certainty. So the Investigations is very, very different than the Tractatus. Very different for a few reasons. The Tractatus was very schematic, very abstract, and the Tractatus introduced theories about how language works from a very, very distant position relative to actual language. So in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein has a theory about how language works. He doesn't get into any of the details, really, of actual language or specific languages or any of the complexities that arise when you get close up to actual languages. He stays from a distance and he theorizes from a distance, so his account is very, very abstract. There aren't concrete details in it, as we've seen, but it's quite all-encompassing. You get a very wide picture of language. You get an account of language in its entirety, but you don't get any details. In the Investigations, Wittgenstein completely reverses this approach. I think in the Tractatus, the work is difficult because it's difficult to fill in the details, but you roughly know what Wittgenstein is aiming at. In the Investigations, Wittgenstein only pays attention to details. he consistently looks at examples of ways that people actually do use language. And when you're following Wittgenstein's discussion, it's difficult because although you can understand his observations about language use from sentence to sentence, often when you step back, you have no idea what the point of the discussion was. So you precisely don't have that wide view. You have very, very close discussions of particular examples of language. You don't have an overarching theory tying all of these observations together. In the Tractatus, you have an overarching theory and no details. In the Investigations, it's completely the opposite. This isn't an accident. This the way that the book is written, the Philosophical Investigations, the way that it is written is intimately linked to what Wittgenstein is trying to say. So the reason you don't get an overarching theory guiding all of these specific observations in the Investigations is because Wittgenstein in the Investigations is rejecting that kind of philosophy, the kind of philosophy that gives you sweeping, generalizable theories about phenomena. Wittgenstein is expressly rejecting that. He's saying that philosophers have spent too much time thinking and not enough time looking, and that they're trying to produce, or they have been trying to produce, overarching theories which neatly categorize phenomena. And one of the examples he gives is his own prior theories in the Tractatus. He thinks his prior work was an example of excessive theorizing and sort of negligence with respect to the variety of things that don't easily fall into theories, neat philosophical theories. So the Investigations lacks an overarching theory because Wittgenstein is trying to show us that no such theory about how language works is really possible. So those are a few words about sort of the differences in style and approach of the works, but I assume that these differences will come out in greater sort of detail as we get through the Investigations. I want to start now just with the very beginning of the work, Wittgenstein's discussion of Augustine's view of language, and Wittgenstein's reaction to this view of language. So, one thing to say before we press on is Wittgenstein uses a paragraph of Augustine's in which Augustine describes how he thinks he learned how to use language. It's important to know that Wittgenstein, where he uses Augustine as a kind of example figure, is also to a very great extent talking about his own prior views in the Tractatus. I think we can substitute Augustine for Wittgenstein's own view in the Tractatus sometimes when we're thinking about Wittgenstein's views in the Investigations. Wittgenstein puts Augustine's view of language on show, and where he criticizes it, he's criticizing the Tractatus for committing the very same mistakes. But I think Wittgenstein thinks that the errors that Augustine makes and he himself makes are very widespread among philosophers when they're thinking about language. But it's important to keep in mind that background context, that he's just as concerned with his own previous thought as he is with Augustine's. So what does Augustine say, or what does Wittgenstein say that Augustine's view is? Well, Augustine is describing how he thinks he learned how to use language. And what Augustine is basically saying is he learned how to use language by watching people point at objects and make noises. Like book. Look at the book, point at the book and go, book. And likewise for many other objects, chairs, tables, anything like the sky, trees, clothes, people, heads, ears, etc. That's the idea. That's what Augustine says. He says, before he knew how to use language, he just watched people point, make a noise, and after he'd watched that happen enough times, he got the association, the intended association, and he started to be able to know when to use the same noises correctly. I think that this is a kind of natural or intuitive view about how we learn language. And I think Wittgenstein thinks that it's a natural view to adopt. If you're to ask someone, how does anyone learn a language? You might think that there's a fair chance someone would come up with Augustine's idea. We learn language by watching people point at things and make noises, and then we grasp the associations between the noises and the things, and we come to be able to confidently use the same noises for the same things. And Wittgenstein, I think, is aware that this is a natural view about how we learn language, but he thinks it's wrong. He thinks it's wrong for a few reasons, and that's what we're going to discuss in the remainder of this video. Firstly, he mentions that really what Augustine has in mind here are just one kind of word, namely nouns, words of things. And Wittgenstein says that people who agree with Augustine generally don't pause to think about how they learn to use verbs or adjectives, and for other words like auxiliary words or demonstrative pronouns, etc. Wittgenstein says that such people assume that they will take care of themselves. So that's your sort of first. This is not a knockdown objection, but this is leading into Wittgenstein's more pressing views. He just notes at first, on the very first page, this is quite a narrow view. You're only talking about nouns here. Wittgenstein later says, and this is all compressing heavily what Wittgenstein, or his view is, or his objections, but Wittgenstein later points out that this view of how we learn language is based on the view that we learn language via so-called ostensive definition. That just means pointing at things and using the word, okay? So Wittgenstein says that ostensive definition can't, on its own, teach you how to get from no language to language. Why does he think that? He thinks it for a few reasons. So firstly, he notices that given any particular ostensive definition, any specific act in which I point and make a noise at an object, Wittgenstein says, given any specific example of that, it can always be interpreted in countless numbers of ways. So imagine I have this object here, philosophical investigations, but imagine we've got no language and I point at it and go, book. Am I pointing, well, the simple question is, what am I pointing at? Am I pointing at this colour or this colour, or am I pointing at something that's roughly speaking cuboid? Am I pointing at something with different colours? Am I pointing at something that's heavy or light? No. Wittgenstein thinks it's completely indeterminate given an object and my pointing at it. what it is I'm pointing at. I mean, I might not even be pointing at anything on what we would ordinarily call a book. I might be pointing at the air before the book, or I might be pointing at the surface. It's very, very unclear. It's completely indeterminate, Wittgenstein says. So ostensive definition, I mean, this again is simplifying very much Wittgenstein's objections, which we'll get into much more great detail in the in-person sessions, but he just says ostensive definition can't get you from no language to some language because it's always completely undetermined what is being pointed at. And so Wittgenstein points out that, for instance, let's say I'm pointing at this colour green. If I say that colour is green, I'm using kind of ostensive definition there to point at a colour. He says, well, that's an example of an ostensive definition that works because you've specified that you're pointing at the colour, okay? You've, in other words, excluded the possibility that you're pointing at the book or the text on the book or the picture on the book or the fact that the book's made of pulp, etc. You've specified that you're pointing at the colour. But Wittgenstein says, well, this only helps you if you already know, roughly speaking, how to use colour words. You will only be able to understand that ostensive definition if you understand other colour words like blue and yellow or teal or whatever you want. So Wittgenstein says that ostensive definition requires a great deal of knowledge on the part of the audience in order to work. And he uses his example of someone who, for instance, has learned how to play chess in the abstract, but has never actually seen a chessboard, which is very possible. In fact, let's assume they're excellent at chess, but instead of looking at real chessboards and chess pieces, they've been playing it on bits of paper, and they've made up their own symbols for what we refer to as king, queen, rook, bishop, pawn, castle, knight, etc. So Wittgenstein says, well, this person who's an expert at chess but has never seen a chessboard, if we get them into a room with a real chessboard, we can point at the king and say, this is the king. And that person will understand. That will be a successful ostensive definition. But the success of that ostensive definition relies on the fact that the person already knows how to play the game. They already know what sort of a thing is being pointed to. And when we say king, they go, oh yeah, okay, I know exactly what that is. So there's a sense in which Wittgenstein says that pointing and doing ostensive definition there is one of the least important or most sort of superficial aspects of coming to learn how to play chess. The person's already got to know how to play chess in order for you to say that's the king and for it to make sense to them. If you sit someone down at a chessboard that doesn't even know what chess is and say that's the king, it's not going to help them at all. They've got no context, no background, they don't understand the rules of the game, they don't know what sort of a thing a king is. They might think that you're pointing at an example of something made of wood, and so next time they say a tree, they might go, oh, that's a king. They'd be wrong because they don't have the requisite background knowledge. So Wittgenstein really makes the point at length, in greater length than I have here, that ostensive definition, rather than being the first thing that happens on the road to language acquisition, really it's one of the last. We have to already have a great deal of training in language use in order for ostensive definition to take place and to take place successfully. Otherwise, it's completely indeterminate what's being pointed to. this is one of Wittgenstein's main points in the opening remarks of the book. And Wittgenstein's point isn't that Augustine is always wrong, that ostensive definition never takes place, but he does think it's wrong to assume that that's a full explanation of how language acquisition functions. He says that Augustine's account is rather like that of someone who goes to a foreign country and begins to learn a foreign language. But they already know one language, they already know how to speak something. And when they go to a foreign country, they apply what they already know of their own language use towards gleaning what these foreign words mean. He says that Augustine's view of how a child learns language, because it would really require so much prior language training and mastery for it to actually work, he says that Augustine's view is like that of someone who already knows some language, just doesn't know the language being presented to them. And so, remember what I said earlier, Wittgenstein is also concerned here to show that ostensive definition, i.e. pointing and naming things, isn't the foundation of language. It isn't how we get a grasp of language use, how we gain training. It's a very, very small part of language use. Pointing at things and naming them goes on in very, very specific situations. And so this idea that language is all modelled on names, objects, and us forging connections between them and pointing, and doing so by pointing, is, in Wittgenstein's view, crude and mistakes the very, very specific and somewhat minor role that ostensive definition actually has for being basically in large part the foundation of all language use and language acquisition. So that's one reason why Wittgenstein thinks that Augustine's view is both narrow and wrong. Now, that's enough for this video. In the next video, we'll see what kind of view of language Wittgenstein seeks to replace Augustine's with. Thanks.